So I want to begin reading in Ephesians chapter 3, and we're actually going to close out the chapter today. Ephesians 3:14 is where we're going to land, at least where we're going to begin. It begins this way. Again, Paul to the church. He said, "For this reason I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth derives its name." Paul's just doing a little bit of a play on words there. The word for father and the word for family are related, and so it is. This is the idea of family being given by God. He says, "I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith." That is a big prayer compacted into not a lot of words. And I don't know what your prayer life is. I don't know if you pray. I'm increasingly coming to think and believe that everybody prays, whether it's good or not. That's the question. But there are moments where you just even mutter under your breath. But there are also moments where you enter into this deep, meaningful prayer. And then there are moments where maybe you plead with God. There are moments where you're brought to a place where he's like, "Hey, I actually don't know anything else to do, and I've never really done this before. Maybe I'll give it a try, and we'll see what happens." But I think at some point, each of us, we move into this position where for one reason or another, we end up praying. Paul demonstrates how, I think, to pray in these verses and what maybe to pray for. If you call yourself a follower of Jesus, if you call yourself a Christian, if you think of yourself as part of the church, prayer is, I wrote, a good first position. I think prayer is the first position for the follower of Jesus. Prayer is a conversation with God. And it's moments, right, where we enter into communication relationship with God. We can talk about how to pray. We have talked about how to pray, right? In prayer, how God shapes your hearts, and how in prayer God shapes your desires, make them more like his. We can, and again, have talked about how prayer reveals your heart to yourself, right? Prayer actually, in moments where you're not quite sure what you're feeling, you enter into these spaces of prayer or quiet and contemplation, and prayer actually has this way of showing you what you are thinking or feeling or experiencing in ways maybe that you weren't aware of before. What you pray for reveals the desires of your heart, the good, the bad, the ugly, everything in between. A few weeks ago, we talked about how Paul's prayers are almost always intended to do a few things at once, right? They model how to pray. They also model how or what to pray for. They also teach theology, theological concepts and things of how to think about God. As I was preparing and reading through this chapter in Ephesians, I came to realize that one of the things, if not the thing, that challenges me the most about Paul's prayers is that Paul knew how to pray bold prayers. Paul knew how to just pray in exactly the way he intended to pray. You don't get these caveats. You know the prayers maybe that I'm talking about where you lay everything else, you lay everything out before God. This is what I'm experiencing and seeing and feeling, and this is what we are going through in the moment it is, and we are going to ask for X, Y, Z, or A, B, C, and then because you're not 100% committed, and I've done this, you go, "Okay, but not my will, your will be done." And it sounds good because it's the way Jesus taught us to pray, right? Your will be done. But we say it as this clause at the end, just in case it doesn't happen the way I want it to, I'm going to throw that out there so that I can chalk it up to that if it doesn't go down. You don't get those in Paul's prayers. Paul prays, he prays in this bold way. So just a couple of them. Paul prays this. He says in Romans, "May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with the hope and power of the Spirit," right? He just says, this is what I'm praying for. That's it. That's all. May this happen. In Philippians, and this is my prayer, he said that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless until the day of Christ, filled with fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus to the power, or to the glory and praise, rather, of God. In Philippians chapter 1, this is his prayer for the church in Philippi. He's just saying, hey, this is what I'm praying for. I'm praying that you would know Jesus, and I'm praying that this is what would happen, and I'm praying that you would be blameless, and it's a bold prayer. And continue on, this is the way Paul encourages us to pray, right, in Philippians. "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving present your requests to God." He says, "And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." It's not it might if you pray it properly. He says it. It's bold. Paul doesn't pray like a Canadian. He says it like it is. This is a constant challenge in my household because I'm a Canadian. And I sometimes say things in Canadian ways. And my wife grew up not in Canada, and she sometimes says things in not Canadian ways, or at least asks that I do. And so we always say, you're saying it like a Canadian again. And so the best moment, not the best moment, this is a terrible, like one of the moments where I wrongly got the most joy out of, was about, I got to say to my wife, Connie, I was like, hey, Connie, you're saying it like a Canadian. I was like, hey, I'm rubbing off, and it's not in a good way. Okay. Paul, he's got this bold way. He's bold with God, and he's bold with the church. He's direct, maybe even direct with God and direct with the church. And so he says, I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. Paul's prayer cuts through the noise. Right, what is it? It's essentially, he says, okay, God, like here's the deal. These people need to know Christ. These people need to know Jesus. These people need to know the power of the resurrection. So how about it? How about out of your glorious riches, out of the riches of your love? Like what is God rich in? The Bible over and over and over says God is rich in love. When God reveals his name for the first time, one of the clauses there is abounding in love. And over and over again, Psalm 145, I think it's verse 8, says exactly that. The Lord is rich in love. The Lord is rich in love. He says, out of the riches of your love, how about it? These people need to know Jesus. Would you do it? How about out of your rich love, you give these people the strength they need to follow you? And then he doubles down on it, right? The letter doubles down by telling the people in Ephesus exactly what he's prayed for. He's like, hey, I prayed that you would know Jesus. I prayed that you would know his love. I prayed that you would know his power. I prayed that you would know his strength. And I prayed that Christ would dwell in your hearts. And I'm going to continue to pray it. It's almost like he's saying, listen, like I'm going to continue to pray this until it happens. And I'm waiting, I'm expecting for it to happen in this community. There may be some people who need to hear this at this moment, maybe at this moment in your life, maybe at this moment in your relationship with Jesus. But people have been praying for you. People have been praying for you. When I was born, I've gotten over it a little bit, but I was pretty little. I was born 11 weeks early, and I think I've shared this story. Like I said, preachers just repeat all the stories that they have floating around in their heads. I was born 11 weeks early, stayed in the hospital for 8 weeks after I was born, and I still to this day, I'm 33, soon to be 34. My daughter reminds me, Dad, you're going to be 34 soon. The first thing they say to me is, I prayed for you. Right? Like that's a powerful witness to God in the Christian community. And it has nothing to do with me, it has nothing to do with that person, it has everything to do with the fact that like this is the way God calls you to pray if you are a follower of Jesus. And this is what I need you to hear, if you need to hear this, is that there are people who have been praying for you. Just as though you pray for others, there are people who have been praying for you for a lot longer than you could ever know or imagine or even think of. A couple weeks ago, we buried Shirley Wilson. And I know Shirley prayed this prayer. I know she prayed this prayer. How do I know she prayed this prayer? Because she told me. Over and over again, as I'm sure she told many of you. And then at her funeral, the people got up and they said, Shirley prayed for me. Right? My grandma prayed for me. My nan prayed for me. And prayed this prayer, this exact prayer. There have been people who have been praying for you. And you are called to pray if you are a follower of Jesus, to pray boldly, to come before God and speak directly, and to speak to others directly about your prayers and about your concerns and about your heart, what it is you're asking for, what it is you're pleading, you're begging with God for. And we need to learn to pray boldly. The second thing that as we continue moving through, Paul learned to pray boldly, but still somehow with humility. Right? He's not arrogant in his prayers. It's not, hey, hey, guess what, church in Ephesus? I, Paul, am praying for you. Right? Like he's able to ask specifically and directly for what it is that God has for him, for others. And he's also able to do it humbly. So he says, for this reason, I kneel before the Father. I kneel. And at first maybe we read through it and you're like, yeah, okay, we've been kneeling for prayer, for centuries, maybe longer, right? But for Paul, this wasn't the first position of prayer. For Paul wouldn't have been used to kneeling to pray. In Jewish customs, Jews stand to pray. They would stand and somebody would pray, their rabbi would pray, or they would pray, sometimes lift up their hands. Standing for prayer was a lot more common for Paul than kneeling. They prayed standing with their hands lifted toward God. It's a great image, and maybe the image that you need to embrace as maybe one who has sat or kneeled to pray for a long time. But there's a lot of different ideas or a lot of different, maybe potential ideas as to why Paul is saying, hey, for this reason I kneel to pray. A couple that I want to highlight. Gentiles, unlike Jews, were used to kneeling to pray. And so in Ephesus, you get a mix of people for sure, but a lot of people in that early church would have been Gentile followers of Jesus. Converts from other pagan religions, right, outside of Christianity and also outside of Judaism, would have been accustomed to kneeling to pray. And so there's a lot of people who say, hey, listen, Paul's demonstrating how to pray, and he's just identifying with the Gentiles. He's speaking language that they would know, that they would understand. And I go, yeah, okay, maybe. It's language that they could relate to. But I also think, I remain convinced that Paul teaches in how he prays. And the reason why, in many cases, he talks about his prayers is because he's trying to communicate something more than simply, I'm still praying for you, just so you remember. I write with my right hand. How many here, I don't know if this is a sensitive question, how many here are right-handed? Yeah? It's funny, maybe you answer that with your right hand? How many here are left-handed? Do you answer the question with your left hand? Yeah. Okay, all right, cool. So I write with my right hand. But I'm technically ambidextrous. And so in kindergarten, I drove my teachers just to all ends of frustration because I would switch back and forth. And so my writing would go like this across the page, and then the next line would go like this across the page, and it doesn't help, I also have had dyslexia really bad, and so my words would all be mixed up, and then it'd be and then it'd be really abrupt. So rightly so, they made me choose. They're like, you can't keep doing this. You can't. They told this to my parents. He's got to choose. It's going to be tough. My dad is left-handed, and my mom is right-handed, and so they made me choose. I chose my right hand, I guess. But I still do a lot of things left-handed. Everything I do, pretty well everything, is left-handed except for right. And the only difference now is when I pick up a pen to write left-handed, it feels different. And maybe you can try that, right? Maybe you have tried that. I've got to slow down. I can still do it. It doesn't look as good. I've got to think harder. I need to actually, and this is probably good for me, I need to slow down and think about what I'm going to write. And when I do, I can, just kind of barely, Anna writes neater than me with my left hand. She's 4. But I can do it. And I wonder if, as Paul demonstrates prayer, and demonstrates the direction of humility that I think he wants to go toward, he's actually encouraging in some ways something similar. And it's just to say that in prayer, so often, it happens as this, maybe afterthought, certainly while you are doing other things, you're driving down the car, down the highway in your car and you pray, and certainly I'm not encouraging you to close your eyes while you pray, in your car driving down the highway. That's not what I'm saying, but there's a moment, or at least the way I read this, where I realize I think one of the things that Paul's trying to do is to teach you that just by putting your body into a position that maybe you're not ordinarily used to living in, you might actually be able to accomplish something more in prayer. And by doing something that, it's not just, hey, well, so pray while pray while you're doing the dishes, pray while you're at work, and pray while you're driving down the street. Those are good things to do. I think there's something important for you if you're desiring to further in prayer or to grow in prayer or to experience something other than what you're experiencing, whether you're not praying now and you want to start, or whether you have been praying your entire life and you're like, I just feel like maybe I'm not getting the fullness there. So put your body into a position that you're not used to. And I think Paul, in teaching us to pray, Paul in saying, hey, for this reason I kneel before the Father, he's saying I slow down, I put my body into a different position, I slow my brain, I point my heart toward God, and I pray. It feels different. I've got to concentrate. You have to concentrate. Jesus certainly encouraged people to pray in ways that were different, right, than their cultural moments, different than what would normally be happening every day. Somebody would stand in the synagogue and pray, like arms outstretched, and then suddenly they're like, okay, but if I do it over here, then everybody can see me praying. And Jesus has this moment, right, where he says, hey, don't do that. Don't pray like that. Go and close the door. Go in your room and find a place where you can be quiet and where you can pray. I think prayer needs to feel different. And maybe one of the things that you need to try is just putting your body into a different position to pray, to hear, to feel something a little bit different. But like I said, I think Paul's prayer ultimately demonstrates humility and submission. Kneeling to pray, right? Kneeling to pray does seem to suggest a great level of submission and surrender. It's akin to worship. We've talked a little bit about how to bless somebody when in Hebrew we read in English, translated out of Hebrew, to bless God or that God blesses you. It's actually a physical form of kneeling and stretching your hands out and speaking a word of blessing. And I think that there's a thing that we do, that we learn, there's a thing that happens in our heart and our mind when we kneel to pray, when we kneel before God. To kneel in prayer is to surrender your life to God, right? It's a physical sign of what prayer is doing in your heart and your mind, and that is to say, I'm going to submit my will to God. I'm going to submit my life to God. I'm going to surrender these pieces, and I'm going to trust that I'm doing it before a God who loves me and who is for me. I'm going to do it. I'm going to put myself into a vulnerable position, and I'm going to choose to accept. I'm going to choose to receive what God has for me. And I'm going to stand and speak over God. I'm going to kneel, and I'm going to choose to receive. I'm going to allow God to speak over me. When was the last time you knelt before somebody else? Just think about it for a second. I don't always need answers to questions that I ask. For me, one of the last times I knelt before somebody, I knelt to speak to my kids. But I knelt to propose to Connie, right? And there's video of it. You'll never see it, though. It's okay. But when I was getting ready, to propose to Connie, set up a camera, and you can go. You see, I knelt. I got down on one knee. I can never remember which knee it was, but I got down on one knee, right? And I asked her, my then girlfriend, hopefully soon to be fiance, and my now wife, Connie, to marry me. That's the image that I have of Paul's prayer and of Paul's life. It's a sign of surrender. It's a sign of, asking somebody to settle down. Right? That's ultimately, that was the question. I put it hopefully a little bit more elegantly than this, but hey, Connie, you want to settle down with me? One of the actual fallouts or things that happens in Paul's prayer is that it says in verse 17, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. The result of Paul's prayer ultimately is that Christ would dwell in your hearts. And Christians for centuries, a long time, right, have talked about Jesus, asking Jesus into your heart. And it's language that for many of you carries significant meaning, and for other people who didn't maybe grow up in the church, are that's kind of weird. I don't really know what it means. But this is what it means, that Christ may dwell in your heart. What Paul's saying, the word there is actually settle down. It's two words that Paul smushes together to mean live down or settle down or come to dwell and continue dwelling, but it has this rooted, right? And again, we continue reading those types of words, but it's to say, hey, the result of Paul's prayer is that Christ would come, enter into a life, make a home there, right? Would settle. And again, that's the image I have of Paul's prayer before God. The result, if we continue reading, and I pray, says that being rooted and established in love, you may have power together with all the Lord's holy people, to grasp how long and how high, this is a great line, and how deep is the love of Christ. The love of Christ, and to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Paul's prayer ultimately for you, for the church in Ephesus, God's hope, I think, his desire, his design for all of us is that you would become rooted and established in love. Christ's settling down in your life. And that Christ's settling down in your life, dwelling, making a home, rooting himself there, would give you power to actually understand and grasp just how significant God's love is for you. Just how deep, right, and how wide, how high, how long is the love of Christ. It's hard to maybe grasp all of it. Over the long, long history of the church, the oldest understanding of this line is actually that it is or be superimposed on the cross. And so what theologians for centuries have said is that when Paul says how high and how wide and how long and how deep, he's actually talking about the image of the cross. And you can put those words down, however, but when you think of how high and how wide, how long, how deep is the love of God for you, it's meant to be superimposed on this ultimate image of Christ's sacrifice for you. God's sacrifice. A love that would lay down a life. A love that would lay down his life for you. How high, how wide, how long, how deep is the love of God. And I like that image. John Calvin, theologian, Martin Luther, two leaders right in the Protestant Reformation, argue that these four words all refer ultimately and only to the love of God demonstrated in the life of Jesus. Being rooted and established in love, you may have power, Paul says, power to grasp the love of God for you. Right? Being rooted and established in love, you would have power to take a hold of the significance of God's love for you. Right? Choosing to act in love, choosing to live in love, choosing to accept love, understanding yourself as worthy of being loved and others of being worthy of love as well. Paul's essentially saying to you, listen, child of God, you are designed for the love of God. You're designed for the love of God to get a hold of every aspect of your life, every corner of your life. Darrell Johnson, who I've quoted a couple times in this series, a pastor, theologian, lives out west in Canada, he puts it like this. He says, some of us have tapes playing in our minds about how unworthy we are of the love of anyone, let alone God. Some of us have done things in our past that we cannot forget that keep us from expressing the love of God. Some of us are facing circumstances right now that seem to call the love of God into question. And then he says this, "Oh, Father, make them strong enough to press through all the obstacles, to overcome any and all lies and confusion, and help them to grasp the breadth and length and height and depth of your love for us in Christ Jesus." So friends, I need you to hear this again. People have been praying for you. Pray boldly for others. Pray humbly before God. Pray that others would know this kind of love, and pray that you would be able to accept this kind of love in your own life as well.